Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the unique show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. As the war in Syria continues to rage, the role of regional powers and their influence gains more importance, with opposition sources claiming that Turkish troops are to intervene in the Syria war sooner rather than later. This comes as Obama seems to have pinned more hopes on Iran taking a step back from Damascus after its nuclear agreement with the United States and co. A claim which Iran has denied but has been perpetuated by reports that Iran's Qasem Soleimani, commander of the elite Quds Force, a division of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, has refused to meet the Syrian Minister of Defense, who visited Iran, with some sources citing Iranian anger at Syrian losses in Idlib and Daraa. But with the United States now arming Syrian rebel groups to fight ISIS and possibly Assad, the Syria conflict looks more complicated than ever. To shed light on the geopolitical intricacies in the Syria war, let me introduce Dan Glazebrook, a political author and commentator. Joining us from New York, we have Eric Dratzler, founder of Stop Imperialism, and from Canada, we have Firas Ayoub, a political analyst. Before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the geopolitical struggle for Syria.
As the Syrian war drags on, no side looks to be heading towards a clear military victory. On its current trajectory, the war looks to be worsening, with the already devastating death toll accompanied by increasing trans-border radicalization and further destruction of the country's social and urban fabric. The misery for the Syrians also continues as geopolitical deadlock remains in the region, Iran and Russia siding with the Syria government, and the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar on the side of the opposition. The conflicting parties have yet to truly begin the difficult work of outlining an ultimate geopolitical resolution to end the war. This comes as the terror of the Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda groups in Syria has instigated a broader process of radicalization on both sides of the region's worsening political and sectarian divides. Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, as influential regional powers, have attempted to strengthen the mainstream opposition, most of whom have been crushed by hardcore Islamist groups. And whilst it has been advocated that the Syrian opposition's Western and regional backers should gradually pressure Syrian rebels to choose between significant external support and a role in their country's pluralistic political future on one hand, and continued cooperation with any transnational jihadi groups on the other, with incentives for pragmatic political engagement and respect for local civil society cited. But the continued use of indiscriminate tactics, criminal behavior and sectarian rhetoric remains. Similarly, the opposition's principal regional backers, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar, could possibly attain their main shared objective in Syria by offering concessions on lower priorities that they lack the capacity to achieve. And whilst Russia's role of potentially co-sponsoring a genuine resolution would enhance its international standing, better address the jihadi threat, increase its influence over the terms of an eventual deal, and of course end the sense that it is playing second fiddle to a dead-end Iranian strategy.
Dan, let's start with you. How regionalized is the Syria crisis?
Well, it's actually a globalized crisis, isn't it? Because remember, behind Saudi and Qatar and Turkey, who, as you say, are the main regional backers of the rebel forces, lie actually the hands of US and British and French imperialism. All of this was this whole operation was dreamt up some years back, in fact, immediately after the defeat of Hezbollah the defeat by Hezbollah of Israel in the 2006 Lebanon war, when the conclusion was we can't destroy Hezbollah until Syria has been knocked out. And it was at that point, as Seymour Hersh details brilliantly in his article from that time, the redirection, that Saudi officials, Prince Bandar, along with Bush administration officials, met and decided on a strategy where they would funnel billions of dollars of weapons and so on to organize sectarian forces to fight on a sectarian basis against the Shia forces of Syria and Iran and so on.
There are a segment of Syrians within Syria who aspire for a better future, for more democracy perhaps, for more human rights, and they have sought funding and finance from regional countries who are at difference with Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian government within the region. So this is more of a case of just normal foreign policy antics, isn't it? It isn't necessarily Western imperialism. Would you agree?
its foreign policy antics and its Western imperialism. Look, of course, there are people in Syria. There are problems in Syria. There are people who have their grievances in Syria. There were problems before the civil war broke out in 2011, and obviously they're many times magnified now. But if you look at groups like the National Coordinating Committees, many parts of the peaceful opposition to President Assad are now actually in an effective alliance with the government, because they can see that the foreign-backed insurgency that's tearing their country apart is good for no one. And the logic of civil war is that it polarizes into two
So you're
essential
suggesting
forces.
that Syria is also related to other events in the region?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Of course. And it's interesting, if you look last year, the tide was really turning in favor of the government, actually, especially after the defeat of the rebels in Homs. The tide is also turning for the kind of death squads that the West has been backing elsewhere in the region. If you look at the Houthis in Yemen, for example, the Houthis' guerrilla war has been going on for a decade or so. But what was it that suddenly triggered international interest and concern was actually when the Houthis in the last 6 months or so began encroaching on Al-Qaeda's space within Yemen. And that's Al-Qaeda's main regional organizing base in the whole region. That was the point at which Saudi, with the support of Britain and the US and so on, decided to intervene. And that has been effective actually in allowing Al-Qaeda to regain some of their space. So they have form in intervening to support their death squads throughout the region. Syria is one part of it, and the war against ISIS, so-called, in Syria, it's interesting since that started.
Okay, if you just hold that thought, we'd just like to get to Eric and his perspective on this. Eric, if we could take this to you now, how successful have Qatar and Saudi Arabia been in the arming of the opposition?
Well, they've been quite successful insofar as they've managed to successfully foment not just a civil war, but really what's been transformed into a regional war. And I think that when we're measuring their success, we should look at it from the perspective of a prolonged fomenting of this conflict. We can think back to 2011 and early 2012 even, when we had mainstream accounts here in the West from the New York Times and a number of other outlets that documented how Western intelligence agencies, along with the Saudis and the Qataris, were based in Turkey, working with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood to funnel in those weapons to foment this conflict. And that's really now more than 3.5 years ago. And all of the things that we've seen developing in this conflict from that point until now really should be chalked up to a destabilization campaign and essentially an irregular war that's been waged primarily by the Gulf monarchies for their own geopolitical interests. So in that regard, it's quite successful. Now, in terms of their actual gains on the ground, strategic and tactical successes, this is much more mixed because, as we've seen, Assad has not been deposed. The government is still quite stable, and they've managed to make significant gains and victories all throughout the last 3 years. So from that perspective, they have not been successful. But the question is, what is the ultimate objective? Regime change or destabilization and chaos? If primarily the objective was regime change, they have failed. If secondarily the objective is to create enough chaos both in Syria and in the region to break up the country and to lead to a de facto Balkanization, well, then there's a chance that you could call that a success.
Now, is there a rift between them as countries?
Well, there are conflicts between, if you mean between Saudi Arabia and
Qatar,
for
yes.
instance, there's certainly competing interests and competing alliances. For instance, the Qataris have been financial backers and vocal supporters of Muslim Brotherhood networks, Muslim Brotherhood factions, both in Syria and in Egypt and beyond. The Saudis have been much more in terms supporting in terms of financial and terror networks, the Wahhabi groups, the Wahhabi factions. And so in that regard, there is certainly a division in terms of their allegiances, but from the broader strategic and geopolitical perspective, they are certainly aligned in terms of their overall goals of deposing Assad and establishing their own hegemony in the region. And we shouldn't forget Turkey as well, because Turkey is really part of this tripartite alliance between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey in the destabilization of Syria. Turkey has its own political interests. They would like to see a puppet government in Syria amenable to their interests, and they've in many ways coincided with what Saudi Arabia and Qatar have done. And in that way, you need to see it as a strategic alliance between those three countries under the broader umbrella of the Western imperial system.
So Dan, if we could take this to you. So Qatar, Saudi Arabia, under a branch of Western countries which are all aiding and supporting Syrian rebels. How likely is this coalition like to win?
Well, it's really a crucial point, actually, the war in Syria right now, because obviously there was the major losses over the last month or so of major towns in Idlib province, including the capital of the province, Idlib city, to the Al-Qaeda franchise Jabhat al-Nusra. So these were major defeats for the government side, but the government is, with its Hezbollah allies, mounting new offences around the Damascus area and so on. And the next month or so will be really crucial in terms of which side the momentum goes with. And it's for that reason that we've seen an increasing coordination actually between the rebel groups. And this is what I was going to say last time, that since the US got involved, it's overseen a process by which the rebels have been increasingly unified in their military kind of command and control structure under the leadership of the Al-Nusra Front. And many of the groups, one of the main Saudi-backed group, the leader was in Turkey last week to meet one of the main Turkish-backed factions. So there's a broad alliance under the leadership of Al-Nusra that seems to be coordinated by the US and its regional
allies. From a
allies.
geopolitical perspective, how likely are Iran and Saudi Arabia to reach a consensus over Syria?
Well, they're not going to. The real, the next stage of, if Assad is overthrown, that will just, as Martin Dempsey said last year, from the US Chief of Staff, he said, look, that will just lead to a new round in the civil war, because then the rebel groups will start fighting each other and so on. It's only alliances of convenience that are being patched up at the moment.
So who is the winner in the Syria war as we speak?
Who is winning, did you say?
Yeah.
Well, at the minute, sadly, I think the momentum is with the forces under the leadership of Al-Nusra, at least in the north. But that doesn't, if we're taking a more long-term perspective, as Eric said, the government is still pretty solidly in control of the capital and of the other areas it controls. So, I really do think it could go either way, and that's why we are seeing increasing calls by the opposition. There have been some talk from the opposition leaders that they are going to get Arab air cover, was a quote that was used, that somehow the Saudis and the Turks are actually going to get more directly involved. Hezbollah has warned of a possible occupation by Turkish ground forces. So they're quite desperate, because this is a key moment at the moment, which could, as I say, go either way. So we're likely to see, and we have been seeing, increased weapons deliveries and so on massively by the Saudis and Turkey, especially over the last month or two, which have contributed to the victories on the ground.
So Eric, if we could go to you, I mean, how would you define geopolitics in the Syria war? I mean, what has made the Syria conflict such a deadlocked crisis?
Well, there's competing interests, and Syria really plays centrally into a number of agendas that both in the West and in the region. I think if we remember back to early 2011, there was a plan on the table between Iran, Iraq, and Syria to build a pipeline that would have brought Iranian and Iraqi energy exports to the Mediterranean coast of Syria, thereby making those countries into major energy export players in the European market, which was a major threat to Qatar, which at this point still dominates the gas trade to Europe. So that was an economic interest in regards to that. Syria also is central in the alliance between Hezbollah, Syria, what used to be the Maliki government in Iraq, and Iran. And that axis of resistance, the Shia alliance, was something that the Saudis, the Qataris, and their backers wanted to break in order to be able to guarantee a couple of different points. Number one, they wanted to expand and further the possibility of Israeli hegemony in the region, Israeli hegemony having been stifled by that axis of resistance. Secondarily, it should be seen as part of a long and broad proxy war against Iran to marginalize Iran and to prevent it from what undoubtedly is its rightful place as a major player in that region, both economically and politically. So there was a couple of key interests in that regard. And then also, Syria represented partially an obstacle for the Israelis with regard to the Palestine issue and the Palestine question. Syria also represented a major obstacle for those Gulf monarchies, because remember
Do you
that
think
Syria,
do you think this has been ultimately an issue which has affected the Syria war? Syria's previous positions regarding Palestine, is that something which would have added an extra incentive for Western countries, for Arab regional countries, to view the Syrian government in a more kind of demonized sense?
Well, absolutely, because if you look at the position that's been taken, even by indigenous groups in Palestine, for instance, Hamas, it's made it a very difficult political situation, even for Hamas and the relationship they have with the Muslim Brotherhood. Syria standing as an oppositional force against those Qatari-backed elements, against the Saudi-backed elements, against the U.S.-backed elements, and obviously against Israel as well. I mean, this is a major reason why Syria really was on the enemies list for the United States, for Israel, and for their proxies in the Gulf. And again, I just want to point out that those countries in the Gulf, they see countries like Syria as also a cultural and an ideological obstacle, because those reactionary feudal monarchies see Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, secularism as the enemy of their ideological position in the region. They don't want to admit the fact that they are the reactionaries, that they are the extreme fundamentalists, where Syria represents progressive politics in the region. That is a fundamental point that is almost entirely removed from the Western narrative.
Okay, keep that thought for a second. If we could go to Dan very shortly. The ideological aspect of the Syria war, the secularism which the Syrian government has, is there a real alternative to the Syrian government in Syria as we speak, a secular alternative?
No, because the kind of secular opposition, and to be honest, I don't like this false divide between kind of secular and Muslim, which is also, fits in with the kind of false divides between Sunni and Shia. The issue is the resistance axis being undermined by imperialism and its feudal allies, as Eric was kind of referring to them as. But the kind of the resistance to the Syrian government that existed in 2011 and prior to 2011, that was not sectarian, that was not formed of these kind of head chopping death squads who want to kill all the Christians.
But some would argue,
that they have basically joined in a critical alliance with the government now.
There are elements of these axes which are from a certain sect. Thus, the other sect feels ostracized because it feels that there is a religious background, a religious paradigm behind this resistance axis you discuss. Is it not, in essence, on a sectarian line itself?
Well, of course, the groups leading the fight against the government are doing so on a sectarian basis. But that doesn't mean the divide within Syrian society, that there's some deep kind of sectarian divide necessarily, any more than a kind of fascist group in Europe shows that any society that has a fascist group is kind of in some deeply divided sectarian fault line there. So yes, the mobilization much of it has been on a sectarian basis. But by and large, the government has not mobilized its resistance on that basis, and that fact is shown by the fact that the majority of the army, who the Western press were predicting in 2011 would all join the resistance, the majority of the army, vast majority, is Sunni and has remained loyal to the so-called Shia government. So I really think we need to question that whole narrative of Sunni, Shia, and secular Muslims.
If we could just go to Firas now, joining us from Canada. How geopolitical is Syria's war?
Syria's war Syria is like the gravity center for the Middle East. It's always been the dominant speaker among Arab nationalists, and it's had, since the Islamic Republic had the revolution in '79, it's been their closest ally and partnership, especially with the Ba'athist war in Iraq between Saddam and the newly created Islamic Republic. Since the geopolitical aspect of the Syrian war is basically to topple a piece of the puzzle for Western and Eastern imperialism in the region. You've got the West, that France especially, it's always had like an obsession with Syria in particular and Damascus, and they have always seen it as their prized possession before being...
Now, what would you say to those Syrians and those Westerners who would say that there is a revolution in Syria? Most people will point to the fact that there were numerous demonstrations against the government, which responded in a somewhat excessive way. This is what has allowed Western nations to actually accuse the Syrian government of being oppressive. I mean, do you understand that some Syrians may have concerns with this particular issue?
Definitely there's Syrians that have concerns on both sides. I wouldn't, in my opinion, I wouldn't call it a revolution, especially since revolutions usually bring change. They don't bring...
How would you define it?
I would define it as an uprising more than anything, more so of a class uprising than anything else, where you have more rural Syrians who were sort of alienated by government programs. The agriculture, all that field was sort of taken in by the government, and they were left with without a penny. So they had to turn. The only thing they had to turn to was sort of a militant sort of action towards the government, against the government.
Because I'm sure you're well aware of the many studies which have appeared after the Syria war began, stating that agriculture and different other primary fields of income and resources for Syria, they were major factors, such as the poor harvest, for instance. They were factors behind what many of the protesters actually had legitimate grievances for the government on. But if you could take this from a geopolitical perspective, how would you perceive the role of a former Syrian ally, Turkey, in the Syria conflict? Has it played a role which is natural for its political position?
I wouldn't go as far as calling Turkey a previous ally. I'd say Turkey has always had sort of business with Syria, that's for sure, but they've always pursued their own independent sort of agenda in the region. And they've done it very smartly. They were, just before the Syria war started, they were included into NATO, which sort of got them the backing of Western states to, if anything was to happen to Turkey, they would intervene and protect an ally in the region. But going as far as saying that Turkey did a complete reversal, 180, and when the Syrian war started, I wouldn't say so. I would just say that they were playing it smart, especially with the Arab Spring in 2011. Libya happened. They wanted to get in on the gas profits in Libya, and they did so. So it's more of an opportunist approach to the conflict than anything else.
Firas, how has the Syria war eroded alliances in the Middle East?
It's eroded some, and it's actually built some up, I would say. You've got a global alliance of Islamists right now. It's not really a particular group, but they all share the same ideology who are backing that. And you've got Saudi and Qatar with their power stations in the media, such as Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. They're the ones sort of influencing and bolstering support for these sort of wars in the region and bringing
now,
in
the
manpower.
US also plans to further arm Syrian groups. How do you think this will play out?
It's just, in my opinion, it's just another way to keep it going. The US isn't really in the business of solving conflicts more than it is in keeping them going. Like, not if they can keep the conflict in Syria going, the job is done. Syria is continuously at war with itself. Israel is safe. They can barely interfere in Lebanon. They can't do much in Iraq. Syria is being neutralized more than anything by the continuous flow of fighters and training by the West.
So, if we could take this to Eric now. What's the view on the US, from the US, regarding the arming of rebels in Syria, seeing as you're from New York now?
I'm sorry, what about the U.S.? I missed the first part of the
What's
question.
the view from the US on Obama's plans to further arm rebels in Syria?
Well, to be quite honest, if you mean in terms of the political opinion, this seems to be going in that direction because Obama really, to a large extent, was the one who was more reluctant to follow through wholeheartedly with these plans. Of course, the neocons, such as John McCain and those who have backed him and that faction, they have been full bore in favor of expanding this war as much as possible. You have many Democrats of Obama's own party who have been on that position as well. And Obama's really come along, I think, to a large degree in terms of that policy, though he's wanted to do it in a limited fashion because, well, quite frankly, for his own political perspective, he's on his way out next year, and he would like to leave the Syria situation in a status quo. He doesn't want it to necessarily get out of control any more than it has. But the reality is that Obama doesn't really make these decisions. It's the foreign policy establishment more broadly, which is not specific to a given party. The Israel lobby has a tremendous sway in all of this. There are various factions, various interests which have been pushing this agenda, and unfortunately that's likely to continue precisely because we're seeing a renewed drive towards expanding this war and towards fortifying the terrorist groups that they've been supporting, not only in terms of arms, but now you see a renewed drive here from certain quarters in the United States for no-fly zones. You see certain quarters here talking about humanitarian corridors and other issues which are all really broadly just pretexts. They are coded language for expanding this war and expanding the U.S. war. All of this under the broad umbrella of ISIS. ISIS is the ultimate pretext, is the ultimate catch-all for the U.S. policy. If the U.S. can fashion itself as fighting against ISIS, that gives it a blank check to expanding the war in Syria.
Okay, last question now. Is there concern over the number of U.S. jihadists in Syria, and is this concern actually growing on a day-to-day basis?
To some degree it is, but it's stoked by various pretexts such as the rampant Islamophobia. As you've seen, ISIS, like I said, is used as this catch-all, as we saw with this shooting in Texas recently. There's growing concerns about the radicalization, so-called Islamization. But these are really trading in racist terminology. It's a racist current that is deeply embedded in the fabric of the U.S., particularly on the right wing. So in that regard, it certainly is. And of course, it's also part and parcel of hatred of Obama. They see that Obama is a feckless leader who hasn't really shown leadership from their perspective in Syria. So what they're talking about on the one hand is Islamization, which is racist. And on the other hand, they're talking about weakness, which is also partially, at least, motivated by race. And so there's a lot of cultural reasons why in the U.S. it seems that public opinion is moving further to the right, further in a belligerent and warmongering direction.
Okay, Eric Draxler there, founder of Stop Imperialism and geopolitical analyst. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Okay, Dan Glazebrook here. It is reported that 6,000 Europeans are currently in Syria fighting for ISIS and other jihadist groups. How does this, in fact, change the regional dimension of the geopolitical war in Syria?
Well, I think, Britain really kind of learned the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, which if you want to wage these wars of aggression, then try to do it without using your own army, without your own soldiers coming home in body bags, because that loses you political support and it makes the war unpopular at home and more difficult to fight. And Britain has very cleverly managed to orchestrate a scenario where actually 600 young British fighters have gone out to fight Britain's war.
The number, in fact,
Assad.
goes up to a maximum of 2,000.
Okay, well there you go. So possibly up to 2,000. And the most common figure I've heard is 600, but obviously these are estimates. It was revealed in court last year in the case of Moazzam Beg, who had been training fighters in Syria and was actually prosecuted back in Britain for doing this. And he said, look, everything I did was approved and ticked off by MI5. They gave me the green light for this, and MI5 said, yeah, that's true. So they've been facilitating this flow of fighters. So this is very clever. They've managed to get British fighters going and fighting British wars, but in such a way that without having to actually use their own soldiers. So it doesn't seem like there's, kind of white British soldiers coming back in body bags. And it fits into this Islamophobic narrative, which actually boosts the warmongering, as Eric said as well.
The Canadian jihadists which are in Syria. I mean, I've heard that there are numerous Canadian nationals who are fighting with ISIS in the Middle East, especially from a city called Calgary, according to research. how is the whole ISIS problem in Syria perceived in Canada?
Canadians are very, we see that thing of ISIS as even more militaristic than the US. We want to participate in it. The Harper government wants to participate in it. I personally would say go against it. I say Canada has to stick back to its humanitarian side and provide assistance to people who need it, like refugees, displaced people, more than anything. I think that pursuing the war against ISIS is just going to put Canada into the crosshairs of such groups, like it did back in October with Corporal Nathan Cirillo on Parliament Hill. And Canada, the intelligence services were also behind the flow of, I think it was those 3 British girls that made it into Syria.
Firas, if you hold that thought for 1 second, we'll get back to you on it. Let's get a different perspective on the show now with Sharmeen Narwani, a geopolitical analyst joining us from Beirut. Sharmeen, thank you very much for joining us. The Syria war has been called the proxy war. How true is this?
I'm sorry, Danny, I can't hear anything.
Yes, Sharmeen, the Syria war has been called the proxy war. Is there an element of truth about this?
Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I can't hear. It sounds like a mumble from where I am.
Back to Firas. Maybe we can get better connection on Sharmeen's line. Firas, is Iran slowly disowning the Syrian government?
I wouldn't say that they're disowning them. I believe Iran, throughout the whole 4 years, now going into its 5th year, has still been doing business deals with Syria's enemies now, such as Turkey and Saudi and Qatar. It's just Iran is probably trying to find a different solution than just militarily against the Free Syrian Army, al-Nusra, and other groups. So they're trying to shift. They're not shifting positions. They're just trying to shift their approach on the issue. And I believe Iran, it's in its best interests to end the war more than anything, because this is spilling into Iraq, which is soon enough going to spill into Iran. We'll soon be seeing, if this doesn't end soon, it will soon be seeing attacks taking place on Iranian soil.
Okay, Dan, if we could take this to you as well. The Iranian government has been coming under intense criticism, in some essence, for its Syria policy. But with Obama heralding a new era of peace with Iran after the nuclear agreement, it has been touted that Iran will drop its alliance with Assad to survive on an international scale and integrate into the international community in a better way. Do you see this happening in the near future?
I don't think the Iranian government are so foolish. They've had enough experience of the great Satan, as they call the US government, to realize that, you know, when the US kind of dangles the prospect of easing sanctions, if Iran jumps through any infinite number of hoops in terms of disarming itself, in terms of you know, leaving its allies, throwing its allies to the dogs, etc. I think they realize that, you know, this is probably not going to work out best for all concerned. So I would like to think, and I think there's no evidence actually that it's just wishful thinking really, that Iran is actually, you know, ditching its Syrian allies and so on. Because, you know, even when Obama promised, oh yeah, we'll end sanctions and so on, immediately his Congress kind of rose up and said, well, no, we won't, or we almost certainly won't. So it would be very, very foolish of the Iranians to kind of believe that, you know, if they leave, because as has been pointed out already, the whole point of the Syrian war is actually to destroy the supply lines and so on, the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, in order to then destroy the Hezbollah, in order to set you know, pave the way for an attack on Iran. So it'd be the height of foolishness to collaborate in a strategy that actually served that purpose. And I think the Iranians were well aware of all of this, and it's just kind of information warfare, really, trying to demoralize the resistance axis and their supporters by trying to drive a wedge between them. I think it's nothing more than that.
To Firas, is there an opportunity for consensus to actually be reached between the regional countries to solve the Syria crisis?
Yeah, if all sides realize that there's a kind of a stalemate on the ground and so on, then there is the possibility, and the Geneva I and Geneva II talks, although they were kind of widely rubbished as a waste of time in Western media and stuff by and large, absent the intervention of the big outside powers, egging on basically the forces on the ground to keep fighting and so on, saying that there can be no agreement with Assad and all of this kind of thing. Absent that kind of outside pressure, if the forces involved actually think, look, neither side is in a position to win, that classically in any kind of conflict situation, when both sides realize they can't win, that's when you get the conditions for a potential political settlement. But what we've seen every time we've got somewhere near that point, when rebels have been started to get demoralized, realize they're not going to have a military victory, is the West has then piped up, kind of, again, dangling, creating false hopes that they're going to come and do an intervention on their behalf. They should keep fighting. They, keep pushing on. Assad can't have any future in Syria, blah, blah, blah. So they've actively sabotaged that possibility. But yeah, if the powers on the ground, including the regional backers, but really believe that this is going nowhere, then yeah, there is a potential for a political settlement.
Firas, last question to you. How do you see the war in Syria going now?
Almost half a year ago, we heard the government say that they were a half a year to a year from winning the war, and things took a turn. So I don't see a possible end coming anytime soon. I think there's a lot of parties involved, and a lot of parties have the same goals, the end goals that they've been pursuing for the past 4 or 5 years. And I just don't see that becoming a reality. And it's just going to take a lot, like the other presenter said, that it's going to take some realization by parties on the ground inside of Syria that this war is not going anywhere and that they have to come to the table together and solve something. Geneva I, Geneva II, like you said, did not work, and mainly because you have a group that was created outside of Syria with no real connection to any of the fighters or the groups inside, and they hold no representation among Syrians. So those negotiations, that dialogue was between one legitimate party, the government, and one that had no real power or structure to it. But yeah, once they reach the realization that this war is not going anywhere, that it's only creating more destruction and less hope, less future for Syria, and I think that's going to take some time, but only until then will we reach a final solution.
Okay, excellent. Firas Ayoub, political analyst, joined us from Canada. Thank you very much for being on the show. Dan, if we could take this to you for the last time for this section, what is needed to solve the war in Syria?
Well, really, as I said before, the outside powers need to step back, especially the Western powers that are not even, don't even have any regional particular involvement in it, but are simply egging on and supplying weapons and keeping the thing going. They need to stop doing that, obviously. And yeah, there needs to be a recognition by both sides that there's no military solution. So in those circumstances, there can be a political negotiation. Of course, the other possibility is that one or other side does win a military victory. And like I say, that the thing is that hasn't been ruled out yet. Actually,
so will
I think that is
ceasefire
possible on
actually
either
work
side.
if it was
And
to
the
be
next few
implemented
months
on
will
the
be very
ground?
decisive in that. Sorry, go on.
Would a ceasefire actually work if it was to be implemented on the ground?
It depends on the circumstances. I think right now, when both sides have offensives ongoing, just underway, that they're very optimistic about, then probably not. So unfortunately, I think the reality is that the conditions right now are not probably right for a ceasefire. That's my opinion.
Okay. Firstly, we apologise for our guest in Beirut who had technical difficulties with her phone. Please stay with us as we move on to the next section. Now, the Syrian government is reeling from a series of setbacks in the north of the country, with the year 2015 heralding a nightmare for the Damascus government. 25% of rebel-held area of the government-held area has been lost in the previous month, posing strong questions as to the durability and reliability of the Syrian military establishment. Moreover, the collapsing currency was the latest sign of the government's growing troubles as a string of rebel victories and rumours of internal discord has exposed more weaknesses in the Syrian state than many previously assumed. We discuss how much of this is myth and how much of this is true. Let me introduce Matthias Christiansen, joining us from Copenhagen. He's a Syria analyst and consultant. Matthias, questions have been raised about the future of Assad. Is it now more under threat than ever before?
I think Assad is at his weakest that he's ever been. That said, I think it's a long-drawn conclusion that it's over. The rebels, let's be honest about what the rebels have taken. They've taken a very important crossing into Jordan. Basically, there is a small crossing to the east of Dara crossing, but other than that, they've taken a rather small city. Idlib in the north and half of Aleppo and the rest of the country, and Raqqa, of course, and Deir ez-Zor is half taken. But let's be honest, the main part of Syria, the important cities, are still in the Assad's hands.
Has the Syrian army lost its military capability in an offensive capacity?
It seems so. I mean, that has been for a long time. There's been a stalemate on the ground for many years now. I mean, what we've seen in Syria since 2012, basically, is that the rebels have taken up positions largely in the suburbs of cities, and the state military has taken up the large portion of including the central parts of cities. And that is a stalemate that we've been seeing since 2012. And yes, I mean, there has been a development with the takeover of Idlib, but I think it's a little bit far-fetched to say that conditions have seriously changed.
Okay, if we could take this to Dan for the time being. The recent rebel momentum has been largely because of an influx of more weapons and a more overstretched Syrian army. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, by and large I would, yeah, especially the influx of weapons. And this relates to the issue we were discussing earlier on about arming the rebels. And the US has always taken this position that it's only arming moderate rebels and so on. But we always see, and we've seen this again and again, they'll arm their particular preferred faction of the FSA, and then photos will emerge within months or weeks sometimes of those same weapons in the hands of ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra and so on and so forth. Because the reality on the ground is that the anti-government forces are increasingly uniting. We've seen a section in the battle for Idlib, sections of the Free Syrian Army united with
success has been down to the fact that a lack of ability to promote this kind of secular, this liberal ideology to Western backers who would see these rebel groups as a basis for a future Syrian national army?
The issue, I think, is what is the nature of this insurrection? And as I said before, that the kind of people on the ground who are protesting, who are peacefully protesting for a more democratic Syria and so on in 2011, many of them now have actually been bought into the government. There were huge numbers of reforms. Many of those initial demands for multi-party democracy and so on were actually met by the government. And as a result, many of those groups have actually joined, as I say, kind of have begun critically supporting the government, because they can see the nature of the foreign-backed insurgency and they're not happy with it and they want no part in it. So there just isn't, and even Obama himself admitted these rebels.
Syria especially. Does this state of affairs in particular reiterate the importance and significance of a political solution and a peaceful one?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's obviously the ideal outcome. Sorry, so your question was what? Did the latest developments reinforce that?
Does this overall state of affairs reiterate the importance of a political solution?
Yeah, but that's been clear really from very early on, as was said by your previous guest. You know, there's been the kind of war hasn't actually really hugely changed. Not much has changed hands in the last 2-3 years. So obviously, a political settlement is the solution. But as I say time and again, those forces that actually have been promoting this insurgency from the start, those very powerful outside players, namely US, Britain, France, and so on, have always gone out of their way to sabotage any potential for political settlement. For example, I think it was around the time of the first Geneva conference, rebels were beginning to be demoralized. Some of them were saying, look, we should negotiate, etc. And you have people like Cameron, William Hague, British Foreign Minister, all these people saying, no, Assad must go, he can't be any part of the negotiations. And then you get the Saudis actually starting to pay the salaries of the fighters. Literally, fighters who are too demoralized to keep fighting, just, okay, pay them to keep fighting. So they've gone out of their way to sabotage the prospects for political settlements time and again.
Iran is also paying fighters' salaries in Syria, are they not?
Okay. Yeah, but what I'm talking about is the timing of exactly when the conditions were such that a political settlement seemed possible. Suddenly, at that point, these decisions are taken.
Okay, let's take this to Matthias for a second. There is a growing narrative that the Syrian state is close to collapse. Is there actually any truth in this?
I think the regime is weakened, but I think it's far from being collapsing. I think the further the rebels will go, now they've taken up Idlib and they're closing in on Latakia. The further they come in closer to Latakia, the more of a sectarian element this conflict will take, which already has a very sectarian element. Then it becomes a fight for survival for the Alawite villages, which are centered around Latakia. And then it becomes a very different equation. I don't think this is over. I don't think this is nearing its end.
Now, last question to you. How do you see events in Syria transpiring now?
In terms of?
In terms of the direction towards the future, I mean, how do you see events on the ground, the dynamics changing?
There seems to be a little bit more cohesion amongst the rebels. And just to comment a little bit on what your earlier guest said, I think cohesion is necessary if there is supposed to be a political solution. It's only if there's a little bit of a unity militarily amongst the rebels that you can actually have two sides sitting across the table and agreeing to ending the fighting. If there's no such cohesion, and if it's the multitude of different fighting groups that we've seen more than 1,000 different militias in Syria, then it becomes a very difficult political debate to take. And it does not seem like many of those rebel groups see themselves as being politically representative by the coalition, the Syrian opposition, politically exiled in Turkey. So unless there's a real Syrian political unity inside, both on the opposition side and both on the Syrian regime side, a political solution is not very likely to happen. But that said, I do think that we're actually nearer to a political solution due to the events that have taken place over the last month or so. The main example would be the Jordan crossing. If the rebels can actually hold on to territory which is strategically important for the regime, then the regime is more likely to sit at the table. And the more power the opposition has, the more likely a political solution.
Because if I could just add one point. The UN is currently proceeding with talks between political opposition forces and the Syrian government officials in Geneva, sponsored by Stefan de Mistura, who also had his own opinion to the Aleppo ceasefire. But these talks and dialogues, which are occurring as of today, are actually meant to bring all sides to one table and to solve the Syria crisis. Do you think that events in Idlib and other military pressures on the Assad government would force Assad and Syria's hand into making a quick political solution?
De Mistura has actually said that this is not an idea to bring about a peaceful solution. The idea of the third round for Geneva,
a dialogue between them
parties,
to then have a political solution.
It's actually not going to be a dialogue between them. It's going to be a dialogue between the UN, so the representatives that
individually, not together. Yeah,
indeed. And I guess that's somehow a little bit way forward, but I don't have much hope for it. I thought that the Aleppo ceasefire was a bad idea. I mean, a ceasefire in itself is a very good idea, but I don't think you can see a little part of a very destroyed part of Syria in isolation and then simply take that as a little playground for where you can have your ceasefire. If a ceasefire is supposed to take place, then there needs to be, like I said earlier, an opposition which is cohesive and a Syrian government which is cohesive and always has been.
Okay, Matthias Christiansen, Syria analyst and consultant, joined us from Copenhagen. Thank you very much for being on the show. Now,
thanks.
Last question to you as well, Dan. How do you see events now developing in Syria?
Again, I think we have to see it in the whole regional and global context. And this whole strategy that's been pursued, particularly since 2011, by the Western powers, of rolling out death squads across the global south, across the Middle East and North Africa, began in Libya, into Mali, into Nigeria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. This whole strategy is beginning to unravel. It began with the toppling of Morsi, who was actually on the verge of contemplating sending the Egyptian army in to aid the Syrian death squads. He's obviously been overthrown, and that cut off the new government in Egypt, cut off the flow of fighters from Egypt to Syria. Now Egypt's intervening in Libya after the pro-sectarian militia parties lost the election in Libya. Now Egypt's intervening there to support the new government that's trying to put an end to this disaster. And we're seeing, last year certainly we saw the tide turning in Syria. So we're going to see increasingly desperate acts along the lines of the Saudi intervention in Yemen, which effectively is de facto in support of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. As I said, we're going to see more and more of these kind of desperate acts to prop up these death squads, these sectarian militias. And that's what we're going to see more of in Syria as well, in terms of Syria, it's the Saudis, Turkey, the US, Britain, etc. All are going to be massively trying to ramp up their support for the death squads who they're still worried may yet actually just meet a total military defeat. So we're going to see increasing desperation from their supporters, I think. But the tide is beginning to turn regionally against this kind of divide and ruin strategy. And I hope that trajectory continues.
Okay. Dan Glazebrook, political author and commentator, thank you very much for joining us on the show. And a big thank you to all of my guests today. Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Until next time.